Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually really majors in on the world of geopolitics. So what is that world? That world basically is everything that surrounds us, and in many ways actually orientates how you, the listener, functions, because it tells you what is going on in the world, sometimes from the perspective of what we call in the game PSYOP, psychological operations, but many times from the media perspective and how systems, governments, etc. want you to think. And just big business, to be fair, because 9 times out of 10, it is big business that runs governments. So that's why we can touch on practically any subject we so wish to do. And I'm saying we because, again, I'm here with my sidekick, my podcast wife, my 3 in a bed. It's the lovely dame, I'm going to say this time, Fergus Isaac. Fergus, how are you?
Hey, Carlton, how you doing?
Very, very well.
I'm super excited about this one. I'm super excited about this.
As am I.
Because quite often when we disrupt the rules of podcasting by doing our menage a trois thing, we have guests whom we invite because they are experts about a specific thing, or they have an opinion about something topical, and we bring them in for that specific reason. So actually, the chat is very much guided about the topic rather than them or their personality. However, today we have Morgan Khan as our guest. Now, normally I do a big intro. Normally I do a big roll up, but I'm starting off by just prefacing this with Morgan Khan because to many of your listeners, they'll already be sitting up, taking notice, going, oh my God, what? The Morgan Khan, the founder of Street Sounds Records. Oh my goodness. He is actually one of those people that, well, okay, I'm not even going to describe him myself. I'm going to use a quote that The Guardian, the way The Guardian described him. They said, he changed the face of the British music industry without ever writing a song.
Love
That's
it.
impressive, isn't it?
Love
That's
it.
pretty impressive. So, obviously to us, his view of the world seemed so interesting that we just wanted to hear all about it. There will be lots of relevant things. There will be lots of questions that we'll be asking him, in the landscape of global economies and geopolitics. I will preface this to say I know that Morgan's got a book coming out and some other things to promote. So we will make sure that there's room for that as well. But I'm going to start this off by saying that I don't know if Morgan realises, but there is going to be a little bit of fanboydom in this conversation because Carlton actually started his career. He's best known as the first black spy in MI6 and head of special operations, which is now sits under MI5. But he started his career as a DJ. So without further ado,
let's get Morgan on. Let's get him on.
Let's get Morgan on. Let's get Morgan on now that I've outed you for that.
Well, good morning, Carlton. And first of all, I'm humbled by your introduction. Thank you so much. It's so overblown, but I hope not to
Overblown,
disappoint.
surely not.
Morgan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Morgan Khan, founder, owner of the Street Sounds record label, record company exec, producer, publisher, manager, amazing cook.
Now, that's a part that I didn't know, Morgan. Morgan, that's a part
I was going to
know.
go
That's
on. I was
interesting.
going to go on.
Yeah.
going to go. Yeah.
Now,
Why do you think my wives, or my wives plural, have all wanted to stay with me? You know, the sex life has been below average, but the cooking magnifique.
It's been great. Love it. Morgan, that's a fantastic segue into the reason why it might be magnifique, because I believe you were born in Hong Kong.
Yes,
And then you came to Britain. Your father is of Indian heritage, your mother Scottish. So that blend is very nice. And that leads me into the beauty of me saying, tell us a little bit about your life. Just give me the spiel from upwards, from birth, if you will, and then we'll just work from there.
Yeah, my father was in the airline industry, and and it was posted in Hong Kong, which we extended the postings because effectively he loved being there with my mother. We kind of kept extending our stay there. I spent the first 9 years of my life in Hong Kong. Then we moved to the UK, a massive culture shock at the time, for the very reverse reasons probably of how people see the UK now. You know, when you land, be it from somewhere in Europe, the first thing I think that grabs people is the multiculturalism. And that's a good thing for the UK. But way back in 69, I think it was 67, I'm trying to remember now, whatever, I arrived here. It was the complete opposite. I was born in Hong Kong. And of course, my whole environment was, I would say, slightly privileged because of the status of my father. And arriving here, it was predominantly white. It was white. When I went to school, my brother and myself were the only boys of Indian origin, so different to what it is today. So it's almost a kind of reflection, but in a reverse way, to how the UK is today. Arrived in the UK, a culture shock, everything, culture, food, lifestyle. From my life in Hong Kong, you know, finished school in Hong Kong, we'd go water skiing, go to the beach, get on a boat, go over to the China mainland, so to speak, find islands, poke our little pole into the sand, and fresh water would emerge. It was Robinson Crusoe. And then we come to the UK, and you know, a reality check, but also I think essential at that time of my life, because I kind of saw a different world. I was I had been exposed to the privileges, but then with problems that my father had, monetary wise, from this kind of privileged lifestyle, it was diametrically opposite lifestyle. You know, secondary modern school, only two Indian boys in the school. You know, my called wog, flushed head and toilet, all the usual things that are now kind of cliches, but were real at the time.
So not
even cliches, Morgan. I mean, there's a lot in the press this week about that sort of, about school bullying at a big name public school. So absolutely not. I was just going to jump in quickly and say, you know, I'm guessing that that back then there was no nod to your cultural heritage in the education system either.
I just wanted to run on two things actually before Morgan answers that. One was if you can go back at some stage to, because I've been to Hong Kong many, many times, to where you were living in Hong Kong and how you saw the colonial, because it was a colonial upbringing then, the colonial upbringing of that era. That would be the one thing. The second thing would be when you came to Britain and you were the only person, or one of two, of Indian heritage, did you feel Indian, being of Indian heritage, or did you feel that you were of mixed heritage?
Let me answer the first question. and I will answer Ferg's also a point if you can remind me in case I don't, because
you know what, I think they're quite similar. I think they're quite similar. So
Okay.
I'm gonna defer to my husband here, so you can.
your web husband. So in case any lawyers are listening, this is not bigamy. Just
Exactly that.
So in terms of the colonial upbringing, I have a huge issue, and maybe this is controversial. Whatever happened in the past, where do we go back to? Do we go back to the Egyptians, Phoenicians, Sumerians, Greeks, Romans? Where do we go back to and say a nation was suppressed? Where do you go back to and say a nation was raped? Whatever terminology you want to use, that's being used about the British Empire, the colonial days, reparation, famous big word right now being used about what we did. Let me give you my standpoint, which many people won't agree to, but it's my point of view. So frankly, I don't give a shit. I'm saying we, maybe I'm so Britishified, if that's a word. What the British Empire did, and what the colonial, very many of the colonial countries, be it France, Spain, the United Kingdom, Portugal, when they populated and they decided to cut up Africa and cut up the Far East, that was wrong. There's no question. They came into a country, they took out a lot of the resources, they extracted so much of the call it maybe cultural heritage, and tried to implant their beliefs, their ideologies, their norms. That was wrong. But they also gave a lot. They gave a great deal and built the infrastructures of many of these countries. And many of these countries have also to give thanks for what these colonial countries did do. And this is going to be a very probably contentious point. And I find this whole cancel culture, this whole, call it woke, this was wrong, let's cancel it out, this is how it should be, and imposing almost a draconian kind of liberalism that's not liberalism. It's almost becoming a point of being a doctrine that the concept of woke is great. Equality, there's no question. Racial, religious, sexual, there should be equality. Do what you want to do. If you're over 18, do what you want to do. It's been my philosophy in life, and I've kind of achieved what I have achieved by looking at the man and saying, I will do what I want to do, but I won't hurt anybody, and I'll do it with my best integrity, with the knowledge that I'm doing something, one, that I hope I'm a good person and it's contributing and it's a positive effect on society. Man, if it gets, starting on a broad spectrum. So the whole colonial thing about, oh my God, we were terrible what we did. I don't look at it that way. Look at the infrastructure. Look at the railway systems. Look at the education. Look at the legal system. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the model that we have is a right model, but the model has been used around the world, and we have to acknowledge. And where do we draw the line? Do we draw it at the British Empire, or should we go back a little bit and draw it at the Roman Empire? So why doesn't Italy give reparations to the rest of the world for what they did during their
right, Morgan? Let me come and work my way through some of this. This is fantastic. Let me work my way through some of this.
This is, by the way, I'm just going to jump in here and say, like, this is like Carlton's parlour room.
This is absolutely. Come inside my den.
It's late night when we talk about this. So I think you're making him a happy man right now.
Absolutely.
What I'm gonna say though, Carlton, is that I really like Morgan to. I feel that all of this is incredibly relevant to the music and to his label that he.
I think this is Morgan's story. I mean, I've looked at Morgan.
So I think, like let's be the first time that he's been interviewed where we're going back to the Roman times in order to reference his label.
Absolutely. I think this is Morgan's story, because looking at some of the things that you've done in the past, some of the interviews that you've had, some of the shocks that you provided to individuals. I mean, I think on one show you were asked whether you think that the Labour Party was the natural home of people of Asian heritage, and you said, "Well, I'm a Conservative." So you know, this is not a this is your story. So I've got nothing wrong with that, and everybody should have their own story. And what I would say, from my perspective, is I'm not about cancelling anybody. What I'm about is basically what's an old truth. So let's take Hong Kong, because that's what we're speaking about. If you look at Hong Kong, basically you had the Opium Wars in Hong Kong, the first, second, and third Opium Wars, where one was trying to make the Chinese take opium because that was of great value, and an excellent amounts of money were being made from that. Now, when you talk about infrastructure being put into the colonies, yes, the infrastructure was put in, but if you look at what the infrastructure was done, and this is factual, it's not factual, it is actually factual, that basically what happened is most of the infrastructure was put in place to move the resources out to the coast. So where the resources need to be moved out, so you could go through swathes of Africa after the Treaty of 1884-1885, which was put together by Bismarck, where basically European countries decided to tear apart the African continent, but didn't wish to fight each other. And that was what had been happening, or had begun to happen, that the French and the British were fighting the Germans, and the British were fighting each other over what they thought might be colonies, and therefore they would lose out because they'd ally themselves with the indigenous people. So that agreement, basically, the Treaty of Berlin, was to say, listen, guys, this will be your area, this will be our area, you can have this, you can have that, from the Belgians to the Brits to the French to the Germans to the Italians, and their areas were for them to conquer, take over, and utilize, without the other body coming to the aid of the indigenous individuals in order to prevent that takeover. So that was a clever move, if you will. So the reason why I mention that is that shows you the level of thinking and the level of capacity that was put in place in order to attain what individual countries required. Now, in East Asia, actually what happened, as you know from India, Clive of India, it was actually private companies that began to take over, working against one Maharaja to another. And then in the end, they had to ask for the aid of the British military, because East India Company was basically a private army. And then from there, they worked with the locals to get what they required to bring that back to Europe. And obviously the Portuguese had parts of that of India, and at one stage the French had parts of India, etc., etc., etc. So when you say that a lot was given, what was provided was, for one, the stayovers, those who actually stayed in the country, for them to have a good life. You can see that in Kenya even today. Let me tell you a quick story on that one. I was in Kenya, where I've been many, many times, and I was talking to a wealthy British family who are Kenyan British, who are still there. And I said, I'm going to Eldoret. I said, oh, are you going to see the Smiths? No, or Smythes as they put it. No. Would it be the, let's say, Harrises? No, no. Oh, well, there isn't anybody else. Like, there's 3 million people there, but there isn't anybody else, because they're referring to the fact that it's the colonials that they think you're going to see. You see what I mean? So that perspective was, and I think it was put by Tony Benn, who he said, who was born, as you know, in Rhodesia. And he put it this way. He said, when we were in Rhodesia, we were number one. And let's say on a point of 1 to 10, we were 10. We then had the Indians who worked the business and did a lot of things, was originally railroads, but then did whatever else, well, at, let's say, 2.5. And the African was at 11. So if you, sorry, was it the other way down, going down the line? What was it, -1? So the Asian community there would have been at 8, 7.5, and the Africans would have been at -1. So what he's saying is that was how they perceived the individuals within the colony, and that's how they dealt with them. But that moved around, of course, because in India, the average person who was an Indian was basically one, like the African. But when you move, you become of a higher level. And it's like the Irish person in Britain was outside the colonial system in Ireland was again very, very low. But the moment they step into the colony, they become wealthy. So what I'm saying is, yes, certain things were put in place within colonies, but were put in place in colonies for the good of the empire. Because what are empires, and I don't care whether it's French, British, Roman, whatever, basically empires are the building of a monopoly for really generally economic means, but with a military background to them. So that's how that works. And I see Hong Kong as no different to that process. You know, the Hong Kong Chinese had a history of 5,000 years. They didn't require assistance, if you get what I'm saying. So it's not assistance that you were bringing there. And some parts of Africa have the same thing. You've got to talk about Mansa Kankan Musa, example in Ghana, great empire, didn't need assistance. So what you're really looking at is what do we need in order to make the colony profitable when it's defeated militarily. So that's my only argument with that. But I'm not one for changing that. I'm just for saying, tell the truth about it.
And could I address quite a few of those points? And forgive me if I jump back and forth.
Sure.
First of all, the point that you made in one of my documentaries when I said I identify myself with the Conservatives more than the Labour Party, that was then, and I can actually say now that is a complete opposite point of view.
Right. Interesting.
Actually, I don't identify myself with any of the political parties right now, but that's another conversation. Let's go to a little bit down the line, because Fergus and I have already talked about the politics of John Connor, and if those listening think, who the hell am I talking about? We will expand later on in this conversation. So, in terms of the Opium Wars, of slavery, abhorrent. There's no other word that can be used. And one of my hobbies or great interests is, I think myself as a historian. I kind of studied. I kind of look at the past, because you need to look at the past to look at the future, to help you with the future, not to repeat the mistakes that have been made. So yeah, you mentioned the East Indian Trading Company. I think it began sometime in the 1600s, around that time. And you are correct. You know, an empire has armies. Armies need to be paid for. The empire was about acquiring wealth. And we can talk about the negativity, because all empires have had the same purpose: expand territorial gains, to extract the wealth from those territories, to have influence on those peoples, to have safe borders, and to have allies, and all those kind of things, and also to have men, labor, very important point, men for armies, for future wars, future expansion. So it's almost this cyclical, demonic, bad kind of pattern. You have some, you want more, you want more, you want more. I mean, when is it enough? So that's a theory of empires, and I completely agree, Carlton. But there were benefits, and let us not go into the reparations of slavery, or what we took in artifacts and what we have in our museums, and deep down in I can imagine caverns in the UK of gems and jewelry and possessions from all these countries. That's another discussion, and they should be returned. I completely agree with that. But there is trickle down wealth, and yes, you mentioned about all the infrastructures were to get raw materials, be it gold, silver, copper, diamonds, minerals from
cotton,
A to B.
You name it,
Cotton,
whatever.
Absolutely, cotton were from A to B. But there was also the implantation, if that's a word, or the bringing of, to many of these countries, law and order. India was a country of Maharajas, individual states, feuding tribes, and it was, I'm not saying we made it better. We brought some form of, call it British order, and that was combined with the local heritage, be it in India or be it in certain African countries. There was the trickle down effect that a general
Ron,
population
can I just say one thing on that?
improve their lifestyle.
I totally agree with you, but can I just say one thing on that one? We should not misunderstand, as is often the case, that there wasn't law and order. There was law and order in many of these states. So I mentioned to you.
Carlton, there was law and order, but what kind of law and order?
No, actually, in many places,
juries that were appointed by X person who's probably the cousin of the Maharaja, and that kind of law and order.
May well be.
And women's rights. Carlton, women's rights in a lot of these countries. A lot of these countries, their women's rights and caste rights were non-existent. So there are negatives, but we cannot only focus on let's beat up Britain. We cannot.
No, that's not what I'm saying. You see, this is not what I'm saying, Morgan. Just because we'll come away from this, but this is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying beat up Britain. You know, every empire does the same. You mentioned the Roman Empire. What most of these empires do, Roman in particular, it basically brings you into the empire. So, as you know, you could be a Roman regardless of where you came from. So there were black Roman emperors, Emperor Septimus Severus, example, just to give you one. There's three of them, right? In the British Empire, there was no such thing as a British citizen that did not include, because it was all subjects, that did not include the colonies. So at one stage, before the Nationalities Act of I think that came in first in about 1948, 1949, everybody in empire was a British subject and had exactly the same rights in Britain and elsewhere in the empire as the English person did. Right, so you could come to Britain, you could live in Britain, you could do whatever you want, and under the law, you were seen in exactly the same way. So I'm not arguing that empires don't do that. The French do that superbly, in fact. You know, you've got people like General Alexander Dumas back in the 1780s, 1790s, second only to Napoleon, a black guy who is a.
I like that tag on. I like that tag on.
Yeah, well, he was second. By the way, he was a count. You know, he was a count.
We're talking about the colonial conquest. Let's not leave out, please. Let's not leave out the Dutch. I mean, Dutch West Indian Company.
The Dutch as well.
I mean, here's this little country. This little country you can walk across in. You can walk across in 2 hours that has more wealth because they haven't made it. Because
that's bigger than most of us. Yeah, it was bigger than most, especially in the Far East where you're talking about, where you were, the whole of Indonesia, exactly. So we're not calling down all these, and there were other places who had the same, who were not part of that system and who were not part of the European world. And what you've got to realise is, of course, we're just talking about Europe. We haven't gone back to the Pharaonic times example where Egypt had that. An African state had that same sort of power, or even go back to the 7th century where the Moorish Empire was created and people of colour had that same power. So that I'm not arguing against empires. What I'm saying is warts and all. So, and the one last thing I'll say about reparations. Reparations really is only talked about in terms of slavery, and one of the reasons for it having some credibility is that most people don't know that when slavery in the United Kingdom, and for that matter, indeed in the United States, even though it had a civil war, had ended, the slave owners received reparations. The slave owners
Carlton,
were
I am aware.
And again, that they had lost their slaves.
That is
so now it should go the other way around.
You cannot minimize the effect of families being torn apart, of treating human beings as a product. It's the most disgusting history in mankind. And this has gone on from before books were written, before the written word, way back, as I say, Phoenicians, Sumerians, go right back. Slavery has always been the tool for people
and
to
not
build.
Only with black people.
Correct. Absolutely correct. I mean,
Slav is the word, in fact.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned something about stayovers, but you're suggesting that 90% or 80%, whatever percent of these populations were deported, taken into slavery. They weren't.
No. What I mentioned, when I mentioned stayovers, what I meant was that the states which were perceived to be good for, let's just talk about the British, but we could say for the French, we could say for, it doesn't matter what the empire is, but let's just talk about the British because we're on that. What happened is that in many places where it was decided that this is an area where the Briton can live, because example, in West Africa, they tried it in many places, but the people who were coming over, generally white people were coming over, they were being basically killed by the environment they lived in. They couldn't live there. Mosquitoes were killing them, etc., etc. Whereas when you got to Kenya, it was an area where whites could live. So what happened is they built up the infrastructure for those people living there. That was why the infrastructure was built for them. Basically, look at South Africa. If you look at South Africa in the 1980s, 1990s, and you saw all the beautiful housing and everywhere where the system was worked and how it all looked beautiful. And by the way, don't forget that the labour for all of this is the indigenous labour, right? So when we talk about people building stuff, it's the indigenous people who've built it all. Right, because that's the labour. The architecture may come from somewhere else, but the labour is them doing it, and some of them died in their masses to do it. So if you looked at that, the biggest problem for South Africa was when you take over a colonial system like that, which we then called apartheid, because obviously it went against the British state. When you take it over, what people fighting for the change are looking for is what the people they're fighting against have. So they want the big house, they want the swimming pool, they want everything that goes with it. But of course, when you're catering for 1/5 of your population and giving them everything, you can do one thing. If you're trying to do that for the 100% of your population, it's never going to happen. So that was the problem with the measure for the South African state, because people are not happy with, oh, I've got a better shack. They want the big house that they're seeing the white guy, because that's what we fought for, they're thinking. We fought to get that, not for the shack.
But when does the point come when I consider myself, my heritage, when someone asks you what I am, the first thing I say is, I'm Indian, but I'm British. I say it that way around. Yeah. I always, I'm trying to think now. I'm Indian, but I'm British. Yeah, I normally answer the question that way. And I'm very proud to be British. And I see a lot of wrong things here. As a matter of fact, I've never seen our nation in more of a dire strait. You're not wrong. We're at that again. I want to discuss this in a few minutes from now. Not go into depth for this moment. I've never seen us at a crossroads since I've been in the UK, which is a minuscule moment, blink of an eye in the history of this nation, than we are now. I can see the fractions in the people. I can see the politics. I can see the disparity of the rich and the poor. I can see so many things. And I want to say something which I'll come back again to what I'm trying to get point. One of the things about hip hop, one of the things about what drew me to hip hop is hip hop cuts through the bullshit and it's a leveler. Maybe the only true example of democracy, though the points may be skewed at times. Public Enemy used rap to showcase the injustice between black and white, but some say to also vilify whites. So, but hip hop is to me this kind of megaphone, cultural tool that could be used by people. And I've always found that refreshing. And I'll come to another point where I loved early hip hop, call it legacy, the golden years of hip hop, from the early 80s till about 90, when there was social messages, when the rappers had something to say rather than smack your ass, bitch. And,
exactly.
And, mumble rap, grime. It doesn't,
Boys, I'm just going to jump in here. I'm just going to quickly jump in here just for the benefit of the listeners. For the 5 people on the planet who don't, who don't own a Street Sounds compilation or, aren't aware of of Morgan's heritage. He's the guy that brought Rapper's Delight to this country. There are so many seminal tunes and seminal artists that appeared on his compilations that you will know and love. And actually, I'd completely forgotten about the oral sex t-shirt.
AURAL. Come on, guys. AURAL.
But actually, I personally feel like, having just listened to you two chat, I feel like this isn't just a rap story. This is a story about the fact that, I think we might need to give a bit of narrative to the listeners as well about what
I
licensing.
think we do. I think we need to say
licensing is. I think we need to explain what licensing is, what music licensing
absolutely.
is. Right?
I think we need to say how he did that.
I'm just going to say, I'm going to say, like, my point here is that I personally think that one of the accolades Morgan's never been given is, I think that he's the you know, I think that his ability to license such brilliant global tracks comes from this passion and this understanding of you know, of the way that he perceives the world. I mean, actually this morning I was listening to Yaki Yaki, you know, which is another one of your classics, but that was like my, you know, getting out of bed, getting in the shower tune.
But is it not more than that? You see, this is what I want. This is why I wanted to go through that first bit of who Morgan is, because what I want Morgan to do now is I want Morgan to explain how he was able to enter what is actually probably one of the most capitalist processes, and collectively, the word I'll use is holding on processes of music.
He adopted it and he owned it.
Well, that's the point. How did you, Morgan, get to take from the United States tunes which would then sell around the world? I don't care where. I've been to probably 3/4 of the countries in the world. I don't care where you go in the world, you're going to hear rap music, right? Hip hop music. And the point is, how did you break into that early on to bring it across? So I need that story. So we need to continue your story. Sorry, we got sidetracked. And you're right, Fergus, well done. You did the wifely thing and said, you've been sidetracked, but in a nice way. But what I want to get is for you to basically say, how did you get from there, from you coming into Britain, coming into a British school, to hearing this music and then spreading it into the United Kingdom, and I believe into Europe? Am I right in saying Europe as well?
Yeah, well, and further afield. A funny story. I remember, I think it was 88 or 87. I was at Dubai Airport. 89. 89. I was at Dubai Airport, and this is when you know, and you smile and you go, yeah, I've done something, and you actually can tap your, give yourself a little pat on the back. At Dubai International Airport, there were the Street Sound cassettes. But here's the bummer. They weren't originals. They were bootleg counterfeits at Dubai Airport. And you know, when you have those there, and beside it you had whatever the mainstream artist, but they were the Street Sound cassettes. Anyway, so that I digress. But let me go one step back before I talk about licensing.
Super.
So when I got into the music industry, which is about 77, 78, try and picture this. The industry was 99.9 recurring white. Correct. The industry was primarily controlled by multinationals, be it in America or the UK, and they controlled, be it the ATV corporation at Pi. There's Pi. There was, of course, a CBS, EMI. You can run through those various huge conglomerates, and they controlled through these executives, very much like the film industry of the 50s and 60s, where was the studio system that controlled the film artists. These record labels control the mainstream of music. So I come in as Anglo-Indian, and there was, first of all, almost no one in the black industry achieving anything when I started 77, 78. Right. There was an exception, and I want to give some thanks, and not thanks. I want to give some credit and some acknowledgement to someone called Fred Dove. Fred Dove was a disco. He was, I think his official title was disco promotions manager at the Warner Group of companies. He was and I'll say this, token black employee who championed the music and artists on the Warner Group of labels. And I need to point that out, because I'm trying to reference in my mind, when I started, who else was black, who were not post boys. And I underline that, who were not a post boy or a cleaner or whatever. So I come into the industry, and there were no Indians, and there were no Indians at all. And it always was a case where, when I first started, and I'm coming to the point of licensing because it's very relevant, this stepping back to these early years, it was always a point of, I had to do far more work far more hours, achieve far more, put my own stamp of authority, and that only came from success. It wasn't a case of I had any pedigree or my father was whoever or my mother was whoever or I paid my way. And it had to come to the point of, I had to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G better than anybody else. And that started happening at Pi. The labels I worked with, I created, I signed, I brought on board, had more success than the pop rock labels. And at that time in life, remember, it was pop and rock. Black was
Exactly.
not not even a pimple on the butt of record companies. It didn't sell. There was the odd record that came out before that. Of course, you had the Motown eras, the Stax and Atlantic in America. But in terms of mainstream, it was not considered mainstream. So having success, and here's the point about licensing. So I was very fortunate to become from disco promotions manager at Pi to label manager to blah, 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 blah. And they even let me create my own label within Pi called Caliber. And by having also been label manager of Buddha, Gladys Knight, Casablanca, Donna Summer, Parlette, Parliament, 20th Century, Gene Chandler, Edwin Starr, Barry White. I can go on and on and on. The labels, I was fortunate, Cream, Al Green, Ann Peebles. I was very fortunate to work with incredible roster of artists. And I learned in this infrastructure, I learned in this organization and worked with some of the finest people. Marilyn Hawkyard, she wrote the book of company law. I worked with Dave Mackler, who's my immediate boss. He actually, if you look at your Guinness Book of World Hit Records, he is the editor. His encyclopedic mind was second to none. I worked with some amazing people, and I learned and I listened when I moved. So that was the Pi years, and I worked with these labels. I began to understand the politics of artists, artist management, and licensing. But the beauty is I had Pi's money. This is the important point. I had Pi's money to be able to. Pi Records was huge. People will know that became PRT. Pi actually was a major distributor who had the CBS labels. They were almost the Sony's, Universal Music of the 70s. They were huge. So I learned under that kind of infrastructure, protected, so to speak, but also was always treated as this buffoon, call it whatever you want, this kind of strange person who was in the morning before they got to work, who always was there when they left work, who was this manic kind of person, running around, this is brilliant, this is incredible, this is a motherfucker, this is unreal. That was Morgan back then. And I hope I maintained some of that enthusiasm.
Two things, Morgan. How old were you?
Well, I never lie about my age. I'm trying to remember. So I was born in 58 and I joined Pi in 77, 78. So how was I? How old was I, Guy?
Okay, 20? So you're about 22, 23.
Oh, hang on, no, 58, 68, 78. No, around 20. Around 20, 21, around that age, whatever, around that age. By the way, I found my Pi contract the other day, which will be in my book, and I think I was on £55 a month or something ridiculous at the time. But anyway,
oh my god, that's so funny, because even like 30 years later, when I was an intern at EMI, I reckon I was on £35 a week.
So it might have been a week. I do need to look at that. But here's a caveat of my Pi day.
Well, no, I'm hoping that that the situation might have improved for you. It's not reduced.
Not very much. So the situation.
All I remember was that the more that the harder you work, the more increments you got towards a company car, and then you'd have your like basic level company car, which would be like a Fiat Punto.
Well, it's interesting, you guys, because
and then you sort of move it up, and I just remember when I was at Sony BMG for a little while, we also obviously had the same system, and it like the car parks would just be full of the hoarders, right? So basically anyone who'd been there for 5 years plus who's still driving a Fiat Punto, right? Well, they're obviously saving up, they're trying to get a mortgage, or they're saving up. Anyone who's like upgraded, like anyone who's done their 5 years service and they're suddenly like, oh, actually I can have a Mazda. Like so it was a great it was a real showcase of people's personalities in the car park before you even met them.
It's
I
quite
was
interesting because you guys mentioned this, because I was the other side of that. I was never in the record industry looking as you guys were at artists. When you say that the money was in rock, yes, but you do know all those soul tunes were making a massive amount of money, because I was DJing from about 73. I'm born like you. I'm born I'm born 2 years earlier than you.
Carlton,
So
I need to add a caveat. They were selling in huge numbers as singles. They weren't albums. This is a
correct.
very important point for our listeners to listen to. The
Correct.
record companies made money from album sales,
Albums.
single
Yeah.
sales, no matter what was achieved. People looked at black music as one-off singles or single-based artists. Yes, you had artists, the Marvin Gaye's, who broke that taboo. I understand that, but as a whole, if you look at the industry as a kind of like a blank page, so to speak, it was rock and pop that financed these companies, and that's changed. Of course,
This is what I wanted to ask you. Was this because the effort wasn't put into those artists? So, like Barry White example was ultra popular.
I'm going to chuck
Why
something
was
in here.
the effort not put into it? Could you
But
answer that one?
It's not that content, right? Okay, well, it might have been back in the day, but one thing I'm going to chuck in there is because the cash flow of a record label sort of depends on how much like when an artist signs a record deal, like they might sign for £1 million, but the label's already spent that million, right? Those rock and pop artists, especially since the advent of MTV, it was really, really easy to spend money on their behalf. So therefore, the artists were in debt to you. So therefore, like in terms of your cash equity, like because the artist technically owed you millions of pounds, like suddenly as a record label, you're massively cash rich, right? So that's the difference. That's I mean, I worked for a metal label for a little while, and they almost used to play the system because of this. I mean, that was almost their business model. So we all know that corruption's sort of in there, but I would circle back to say that part of the reason is that a lot of these, as Morgan said earlier, before rap and hip hop and grime and drum and bass and all the rest of it became something that could be commercialized, when it wasn't, when it was organic, when it needed to be organic, when it needed to be street, it was harder for a record label to kind of capture that money because they because A, it wasn't necessary, and B, I mean, like for example, I mean, when BMG signed Britney Spears, they were just rubbing their hands together with glee because she already owed millions of pounds, and it was brilliant because suddenly their debt ledger was just massive, but it was but in a reverse funny sort of way, it's profit, right?
Could I backpedal a little bit on that?
Sure,
please do, because otherwise I'm going to go off on one massively.
No, there's a very important point everyone is forgetting. Black music, disco, call it whatever you want, was marketed in a certain way as these one-off records that the artists had no longevity. There were, of course, the exceptions before. 100 people go, yes, but there was. Donna Summer being one of the prime cases. She was a major artist, black artist, who was selling albums. I know I was at Pi. We're at Casablanca. I forgot Casablanca. I think I mentioned it. But here's an important point. You had to change the psyche of the record company executives. And when I was in the music industry, the record company executives and management saw that where the money came from was album sales from rock and pop. Morgan Khan kind of came into the frame and said, listen, motherfuckers, and I actually talked this way to my MDs in the kind of not rude way, but black music. And this is how I portrayed it to them and proved it to them. Black music can make money. Now, that was the way I sold it to them. It was always my passion, but they needed this hinge pin in their mind to actually believe that. And I show them by bringing in the record that went top 40, top 20, top 10, one after the other. They started charting. And then when I finally left Pi, and I left Pi, by the way, and this is an important point. I left Pi, I resigned from Pi, because one night, I used to come to Pi and work all night. I used to bring my artists back to Pi, and one day I came back to Pi in Marble Arch, Cumberland Place, and I brought with me a group, Osibisa. Some members.
Oh, Osibisa, yeah.
I bought some members of Osibisa, and the security guard
And
wouldn't
the
let
winged
them in.
elephants.
No,
Yeah.
but the security guard wouldn't let me bring them upstairs. He had previously let me bring in
Racist.
up girls, friends, all the rest. I mean, I
Yeah.
used Pi facilities. I didn't have a lot of money. I used to use the Pi directors' bathrooms to have a shower, get myself fresh, because I lived in a bedsit. And
I heard that. Yeah. I heard that.
No, and it's a true story. So one day I bring in Osibisa, some members from Osibisa, and they didn't let them in. And I got really angry. I felt nauseated, embarrassed, and it was absolutely to do with racism. You know, these black men come in with Morgan to the place. You know, the night before I was there with whatever girls, and the night before with whatever other people, and there was no problem. So I next day went to see my immediate boss, and I said, this is unacceptable. I then went to see the managing director, and I wanted an apology to the group, not to myself, to the band.
Mhm.
I didn't get it. I didn't accept it.
Super.
I resigned. I handed my letter of resignation. It's on record. And that was one of the most momentous
You know, Morgan,
days of
can I say something? Not many people who don't have a vested interest in the process, i.e. they're not black and are not suffering that, would ever have done that. Indeed, many blacks wouldn't have done that. They'd have said, oh, well, that's just part of the game. I'll just run with it. For you to stand up like that, that is immense.
Thank you. But it's more than that. But I have always felt that I can't explain it. I'm not black. You know, I'm Indian. I was brought up on Frank Sinatra, the Croon, the greatest big band leaders. You know, my elder brother's music was rock and roll. My middle brother's music was rock. And when I heard black music for the first time, when I heard it on the airways, I had a I can't explain it. Simpatico. I had a feeling that this was what Morgan Khan was about. But that's another conversation. So I left.
I'm just going to jump in with a quick question because you know, as Carlton's listeners know, I've got far too many children. But I try. You know, music's a huge thing in our house, and actually, like, the music room's next door to my office, and my two eldest have just started, you know, recording tunes, and you know, I mean, obviously they're 11 and 9, so they're crap, but you know, since they were born, I've always gone all out to try and make them to encourage them to listen to everything, to encourage them to listen to absolutely every type of music, right down to the fact that when my eldest was born, a drummer said to me, oh, you know, when the baby's in utero, you know, when the baby's in the womb, so what they hear is like a 4/4 drum beat, right? So you know, so they're hearing your heartbeat, the echo of your heartbeat, their heartbeat, the echo of their heartbeat. That's what they're hearing, right? So I was like, oh God, yeah, okay, I'm gonna, and then in my sort of post, like, you know, baby delivery state, the only song I could think of that had that was Rocks by Primal Scream, which is probably really inappropriate to be playing to a newborn baby. Like, you know, dealers keep dealing, like thieves keep thieving, whores keep whoring, junkies keep scoring, like, you know, but
earth-shattering lyrics. Shakespeare, eat your words, right?
Yeah.
But gets the message over.
But my kids have always had access to, you know, they've had access to the record player. There's an Alexa in every room. You know, there's a piano, there's a drum kit, there's a, you know, and like we, you know, I constantly sort of pump like loads of stuff. Strangely, my 11-year-old has sort of defaulted to country music.
Nothing wrong with country music.
Nothing wrong with country music. He really loves it. My 9-year-old is really into sort of 90s. Well, he's into punk. He's really into punk and sort of the 90s remake of punk. My 6-year-old, I mean, my goodness, like he's pretty much into opera. You know, and my youngest, I mean, he's sort of got mild autism, so there's certain songs that we sort of have to roll out to kind of calm him down. But you know, without making this, you know, to get back to Morgan, where I'm going with this is what Street Sounds means to me, really. I mean, apart from the fact that, you know, when I was 15, they were the only albums I could afford, right? Sorry, but you know, but and amazing albums, but what it means to me, it is just every compilation was just so good. There was so much stuff there was so much content on there. There were so many tunes on there. There's so many listenable stuff on there. As opposed to now, I know the world is completely different because we don't think in terms of albums or CDs or compilations or whatever. We just think in terms of Spotify playlists or whatever, right? But I've got so many CDs in my car, for example, where, like, you know, tracks 3, 5 and 6 are great and the rest of it's rubbish.
Well, I think that's the strength of compilations. Morgan, if we can come to you on
Carlton,
that.
So Carlton, can I just end just with one point? We were talking about why black music didn't have the same kudos, respect, priority with a major label. So after very, very quick, when I left Pi after I resigned, I was headhunted by Red Bus, which was a studio and music publishers, and they gave me an open mandate, and I created my first own label, R&B Records, and my first signing was Lee, Errol, and Ashley for Imagination. And the way I used and interpreted what I'd learned in my Pi days was, first, it's got to be about the music. It's got to always be about the quality of the artist, the music, the content, the song, the lyrics. So here we go. I put together Imagination. Our first track's Body Talk, but I marketed it as, here we go. Even though we did the club mix and we used the clubs to break it, no question. I'd used all my prowess in terms of being disco promotions, disco marketing to break the record. I treated it on one level as a black dance record, but on the other side, I market them, and you remember the flamboyantness of their Body Talk album sleeve. They almost look semi-gay. They're Roman kind of askew kind of clothes, the white piano. I marketed them as pop, and that worked because all of a sudden, from being a singles band, we started selling platinum albums. So it was taking and treating black artists as mainstream. And this is the point I was trying to make. The thinking before that with many executives was it was fringe, it was one-off, it was singles, it's disco or whatever the case may be. We're never going to make a whole lot of money. My thought process was this is mainstream. This is society and treated with priority. In my labels, what I've tried to do, Street Wave and West Side and R&B, were about promoting the artist development, not just have them put them out, but spending the same resources and time like I did with Dina, Imagination. I can go on and on through my roster of people who came through me. Spending time doing that development that the white major labels did with their Bruce Springsteens at the time, etc., etc. So I looked at these artists as artist development projects that need the TLC. They need that tender loving care to actually develop them and build them. And that was always my mandate. And because I'd done the licensing, because I'd started with my own label, so I had R&B dealing with my own artists, and my first two artists had hit singles, Savannah, Imagination, I created Excalibur to piss off Pi. My label at Pi was Caliber, so I created Excalibur. And then I started beginning the licensing process before Street Sounds and started continuing my reputation of what I was doing with black music in Europe, but now licensing independent product from the American labels, and that kind of snowballed. So by the time I launched Street Sounds in 82, so a year and a half had gone by now, a year and a half had gone by with Imagination, I'd already built up this formidable reputation of licensing and delivering, important, and delivering, putting record after record in the national charts, which was unheard of. So that's a kind of how I attained the licensing question, which you both asked me. I had built up this reputation that I don't just take a record, I take it, I work it, I treat it as a pop record. I use it. I take it to the clubs. I take it to radio, because I knew radio could not, I won't mention names, your executive producers of Radio 1, which were incredibly, unfoundly anti-black, racist, I would say, to many extent. Not all, some were amazing people. They would not even touch a black record unless you had a #1 club record, unless you put it into the charts from 12-inch record sales, then they couldn't ignore it. And that was wonderful when all of a sudden Radio 1 playlisting your record, not because they wanted to playlist it, because these sons of bitches had to do it.
What I was going to say earlier on, sorry Fergus, just 1 second. What I was going to say earlier on was, whilst you guys are in the music industry from that perspective, I was doing it the other way. I was trying to be a DJ in the game. Now, very early on, in about 75, 76, I was doing the Radio 1 road shows with all these guys, your Emperor Roscoe's and all these fellas.
What names?
Absolutely. DLT, Now Then, I won't mention his other name, but you know what I mean. All these guys were all playing. I used to basically do the road shows with those guys because I worked for Bass Charrington, who was a big brewery in those days, and they had DJs like me who would do all their clubs around the Northwest. So that's basically what I was doing. And I basically was speaking to one of these guys, and he said, hey, you're a great DJ, let's get you on Radio 1. That could never happen, and never happened, even though I sent it just to some great people. And some of the guys themselves are okay, but the system was inherently racist. And this is where the problem lies. This is what I wanted to come to you from, and this is why I think you were successful. Because I think half the guys who maybe went into it I was amongst, all my life, I was the only black guy in most things. Like in school of 1,000 odd people, I'm the only black guy, blah, blah, blah. All my mates are white, and I saw what their music was like. So I was, I knew, Houses of the Holy. I knew Frank Zappa. I knew et cetera, et cetera. And these guys loved that sort of music because they could see themselves in it. Now, additionally, I also knew and liked reggae music. I also knew and liked particularly soul music. I also knew and liked jazz music. So when you're talking about black music, jazz is the basis of American music, regardless of whether it's country or anything else. That music,
the only true music form
correct.
Of America, blues and jazz. I just thought I'd throw that little point.
No, you're absolutely right, because they've been played down all the way through. So you get the king of jazz was some Italian fellow. You get the king of rock and roll, which you get Elvis Presley, which, blacks have been doing that forever and a day beforehand. And you can go on and on and on. Your Frank Sinatra, they had to give something to the great Duke Ellington, a little bit of something, but not too much. So what you find is throughout the ages, blacks had always been pushed to the side in the music game. So to call something black music actually limits it. And I think that's where we were. You opened that up. That's what I'm seeing with you. You saw the game, said to them, actually, you can make money in this game. If you miss out, somebody else is going to make it. And I guess these guys, particularly at one stage, saw that. So can you talk to me a little bit about that?
So that was part 1 of this week's Black Spy podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll have part 2 next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.